All right, you ready?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, let's do it.
Yeah.
What's up, beer geeks? Welcome to the first Styles episode. We're not even sure what we're going to call this podcast yet. We're thinking maybe sipping with style, sipping in style, drinking with style, drinking in style. I don't know. We'll figure it out. But I'm Chris Cohen, creator of Beer Scholar. I'm a national BJCP judge and an advanced Cicerone. And I've got my co-beer scholar, Scott Fielder, here with me. Also,
Hey, how's it going, everybody? Yeah, also an advanced Cicerone, provisional BJCP judge, still got to take the tasting exam, and content creator for Beer Scholar.
booyah. So we are going to go in order down the syllabus for the Certified Cicerone exam, down the entire list of styles that they want you to learn about. And of course, the first ones on the list are like the most complicated beers that we could possibly do our first ever episode about.
Yeah.
So we're just going for it here.
Yeah.
Lambic, Gueuze, and fruited Lambic. Obviously, we should mash those up into one episode because they're all very related. So I figured we'd kick it off by reading the actual overall impression from the BJCP guidelines for these styles. We're not going to read the whole BJCP guidelines for all these beers ever in any of these episodes, but it seems like maybe for the overall impression, it'll just be kind of fun. Lambic. Overall impression. A fairly sour, often moderately funky, wild Belgian wheat beer with sourness taking the place of hop bitterness in the balance, traditionally served uncarbonated as a cafe drink. What do you think, Scott?
One thing we often forget is that it's a wheat beer.
Right.
Like when we talk about Lambic and Gueuze and fruit Lambic, we don't usually think, oh yeah, those are those Belgian wheat beers, because we think of German wheat beers and we think of the mouthfeel that it provides and the way it changes the texture and the way the carbonation looks, the head formation, and so that's the first thing that kind of sticks out is like, oh yeah, like there's really a lot, like a high percentage of wheat in all of these beers.
Right. Yeah, and I think their general overall impression is pretty decent. Mentioning that sourness takes on the role of bitterness in terms of balancing these kind of sour ales, that's really an important point. Yeah, it's funky, it's wild, lots of wheat.
Yeah.
And yeah, if you've been to Belgium, you might have gone to a place like Motor Lambic and been served straight Lambic out of a pitcher, just pretty much at room temperature into a glass, uncarbonated, a glass like this. I've had it, not my favorite beer ever, but it was a cool experience, you know. And then so for Gueuze, the overall impression is a very refreshing, highly carbonated, pleasantly sour but balanced wild Belgian wheat beer. The wild beer character can be complex and varied, combining sour, funky, and fruity flavors. So a little more going on there.
They've got the term funky in there, which you're trying to give an overall impression. So I can see this as being a time for that. But obviously, we want to dive a little bit deeper than funky, especially once we get to our aroma and flavor breakdown. I think pretty solid for just kind of the most kind of general explanation that you're trying to give.
Right. At the certified level, there's certain descriptors you can get away with that are kind of general. If you're going beyond that to like advanced, masters, obviously you have to dig a lot deeper. So, funky, that works at this level that we're talking about. Even at the level we're talking about, I would say like a word like pleasantly sour, that doesn't really mean much of anything.
Right.
All right, fruit Lambic overall impression, a complex, refreshing, pleasantly sour Belgian wheat beer blending a complementary fermented fruit character with a sour, funky Gueuze. What's weird to me is that they're saying that it's basically a fruited Gueuze, but the style is called fruit Lambic.
Yeah,
it does say that. So that's weird. And so, just in case you don't know, generally a Gueuze is like a blend of different Lambics that's bottled, re-fermented in the bottle so that it's highly carbonated. And so Lambic is the base style for Gueuze. And a fruit Lambic is basically something along those lines with fruit added.
Right, yeah, when you're looking at these three beers, you would kind of refer to it as the Lambic family of beers. Lambic is kind of where it all begins, and then these other styles come from that base.
Right. And it's pretty hard to get a Lambic outside of Belgium.
Right.
Scott, you actually have one, which is cool. I couldn't find one, so.
Yeah, I did, and trust me, I didn't just head down to the grocery store, so I had to make a few phone calls. And
yeah,
we snagged one.
You had to do a trade.
I asked a buddy who I'm really close with, and we exchange beer all the time as just we want each other to try like extra beers that we've got from memberships or something, and I just said, "Do you want anything for trade?" And he's like, "No, like I know you'll have something down the road you'll share with me and you'll get me back." And he had
cool.
one laying around, and he also wasn't planning on drinking it, so
yeah.
He said, why not?
And it's funny, I mean, we'll talk about it when we start opening beers, but of all the Cantillon beers, and I had to wear my Cantillon shirt today for the podcast, but of all their beers, I mean, the Lambic is probably the least popular.
Oh, by far, yeah. Yeah.
Because it's not...
simply because I think people open it and they think it's going to be Gueuze, and then there's no carbonation, and they're like, oh, it's flat, like that sucks.
Right.
When that's part of the style.
Right.
So
people don't generally gravitate towards like flat beer.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, so let's go over the history of the style real quick. I used a couple books here to do a little research. This is from 1990. It's the Classic Beer Styles, book number 3, and that kind of contains a lot of what apparently is like the fake, maybe, history of Lambic. And then there's this new book just came out by Raf Meert called Lambic, which is thoroughly researched.
And questions all of that history.
Right. I find that this is kind of common in the beer world. Since like craft beer has become ascendant and the interest in it is becoming very serious and historians start looking into these stories, it turns out that they're all myth and legend, and they all go back to some like marketing attempt, right? Yep. Even if it was one that started in the 1800s, like with IPA, or 1700s or whatever. This history is maybe oddly similar. So the fake, or arguably fake, I don't know, history of Lambic. Yeah, the potentially questionable history of Lambic. And here's the thing. It clearly is an ancient way of making beer, right? To just let the beer get infected by ambient yeast and bacteria. And that's how the first beers were made, clearly.
Right.
The history is, as people have been saying it over the last bunch of decades, is like, oh, this is this ancient method of making beer. Similar kind of spontaneous fermentation methods were used all over the world, going back as far as like Mesopotamia, and that's all probably true. But this idea that Lambic as a style kind of emerged organically in the like Seine River area, which flows through Brussels, and in the Payottenland, if I'm saying that correctly, which is like an agricultural area outside of Brussels. The idea is that these like farmers were just brewing with what they had, and they created this style that eventually kind of emerged in this modern form. And it turns out that maybe isn't very true. Basically, it actually turns out that most of the history is false, and the style actually originated in Brussels proper approximately 240-ish years ago. All the oldest references to Lambic come from Brussels, and they're from the late 1700s. So the first reference to Lambic by name is 1783. Some of these styles and names do just evolve over time, so that's not like proof of much, right? But one thing that's interesting is it seems like it actually came from Brussels, not from some rural farmland area. What it looks like is that brewers in Brussels purposely chose to start doing wild fermentation because it resulted in a stronger beer that was more shelf-stable for aging. And this sort of spontaneous fermentation was actually going on elsewhere, and it's probable that brewers in Brussels actually learned about it from like Scottish or English brewers. And that makes a lot of sense considering that Brettanomyces was important to English brewers. They were aging beer and maturing porter in wood barrels. The name Brettanomyces means British fungus. So the idea is that maybe they wanted to make these stronger beers. They wanted them to be really shelf stable. They saw that the English kind of knew how to do that. So they started doing it too.
No.
It actually makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, yeah.
And there were definite relationships, trade relationships. A lot of the original hop growers and hops that ended up becoming popular in England did come from the area where Brussels is, more or less. I don't know. It's almost awkward, right?
Yeah, we'll see how it all kind of shakes out. We'll see if this just kind of is a book that just kind of is here for a little bit and then people kind of forget about it and say, stop messing with our history, we like it how it was, and that just kind of sticks. Or if it kind of turns into IPA, which seems like it's just been in some sort of Cold War for for decades now, and if it just lingers on and on and on, and we'll kind of see how it all shakes out.
Yeah, I mean, another thing that almost sounds awkward, but which is clearly true, and I think everyone kind of knows this because of the way craft beer has gone, is that, the microflora used to make lambic in the Brussels area is not really unique to that area.
Right.
We know that. We have all these great American and other breweries making, wild fermentation beer that is pretty similar.
Yep.
That doesn't take anything away from the folks who kept this tradition alive in Belgium.
Absolutely.
Right? I still think that no matter how much this new history takes over, it's not like those people didn't create this tradition and keep it alive.
Right.
Right? They deserve a ton of credit. And I feel like a lot of people are going to almost fight against this new history out of respect in a weird way.
Yeah.
Anyway, another thing Rathmere says in that book is that the name really does probably come from the term alembic. A lot of the earliest mentions of the name lambic actually do have an A in the front. And his theory is that the beer was just very strong and very clear, the clarity was very good. So it appeared to people in this era of kind of cloudy beer that this one was had the clarity of liquor. So there was some confusion there, and they ended up calling it lambic. The proof there, I think, is a little iffy. So anyway, you can kind of forget this whole farmhouse, rural peasants, making beer with whatever they had concept. It's not really correct for the origin of modern lambic and gueuze, even though in a broad sense, that is more or less true historically for all ancient styles of beer.
Yeah, I was going to say across the board. That's kind of what people did. They worked with what they had. Yeah. Everything was pretty rural.
Right.
So, yeah.
Well, it's kind of neat to think about after centuries of trying to, incorporate technology into beer making, they kind of went back around to making beer this way.
Yeah.
So anyway, I think we should open a beer.
Yes, I think that's a good.
Yeah.
I think that's a good idea.
Let's talk some sort of aroma and flavor and appearance and that sort of stuff. The lambic.
Yeah, so this is Cantillon Grand Cru Bruxelles.
I'm going to try not to spray Gueuze all over my mixing board here.
Yeah, that is a great idea. We've been there before.
Yeah, not fun. I've got a Hansen's Oud Gueuze. Some good pouring sound.
Nice tiny pop. One that's definitely a little on the younger side like this will definitely pour with, as you can see, with no real carbonation forming. So I don't know if you could see it in there, but obviously have a lambic basket, which is a traditional way of serving. It helps to keep the sediment at the bottom and allows you to not have to sit there with your bottle like this and saying, everybody come over here and bring your glasses while I hold this like this, especially if you've been drinking yourself. I've done that before. So where I just realize I'm pouring beer on the ground. And then for Gueuze, I've got just Lindemann's Cuvée Rennais.
Nice.
And then for Fruit Lambic, I got an American producer. I had one in my cellar that I've been wanting to drink, and I really think they're one of the better producers right now of Belgian-style Lambic variants.
Very cool. Who's that?
I think they're Beechwood Blendery out here in Long Beach, California.
Yeah, they're great.
Yeah, they actually went to Cantillon and asked if they could put a meter that measures the temperature in their cellar and leave it there for a whole year, and it would record all of the information. And then they, that following year, made their cellar the same exact temperature every day for a year that it was in Brussels to see how it would affect their aging process and their beer that they were making. So yeah, they're serious.
That's crazy. I didn't know that. These smell so good. Yeah, when people would order these kind of beers at All Devil Moon, I would present the cork and the whole thing to them with their glass of beer and make sure it felt like special. Yeah.
Absolutely. And so this is Beechwood Blendery. They have a series called Cool Ship Chaos. And this one is with Pinot Noir grapes. So you can kind of see how as we'll talk about later, the type of fruit that's used has almost everything to do with the color of the beer. So, first I'm looking at Lambic. It's got a little bit of like a translucent, kind of clarity to it. And it's kind of in the color range, for BJCP, which for, Lambic is 3 to 6, kind of in that, deep straw to light amber color.
Right.
So I'd say it's probably definitely somewhere right in the middle, deep yellow to light gold. Yeah, it's definitely, it's not going to be something that's as complex as Gueuze. Right. It's kind of got this like really soft, like olive brine, kind of sourness to it.
Olive brine, wow.
Something like that, yeah. But it's starting to get a little funky. This is, I believe for Grand Cru Bruxelles, I believe they age it for 3 years in oak before they release it.
Oh wow.
So it's not just your kind of really young, kind of 1 year Lambic. So
right. Yeah. So a young one's going to have more kind of lactic tartness and less of the funky Brett character.
Fruity.
The Brett takes a longer time to develop.
But this is in a really pleasantly sour, like in terms of acidity, very pleasant, very approachable, place. I would say medium low acidity.
And do they do any blending with that?
I don't think so. No, I think it is traditional Lambic that has just been aged in oak for 3 years.
Interesting.
I'm pretty sure that's the take on this particular one.
So it's all, we don't know for sure, but it could be a single barrel release kind of thing. I wouldn't be shocked if they just blended a bunch of 3-year Lambics together, so there's just some, similarity across releases.
Yeah, and then once you get into Lindemans, it's definitely a touch darker. The BJCP gives it a little bit higher of a range. It gives it gold to light amber. It's a really tight range. It's 5 to 6. It's definitely a little less clear, but you can get. I've been pouring some very good American examples of Gueuze over the last few days. Some of them crystal clear, and you can get either. There's a good range for clarity on these styles.
Right. This Hansen's is pretty much crystal clear. The glass is a little got a little frostiness on it, but it's pretty clear, good clarity. Not much in the way of head, oddly.
Yeah, this has got really kind of grassy notes to it. It's got a little bit of touch of like a rhubarb root. It's got some dried pineapple.
Wow.
Yeah, on the palate, the acidity is like perfect on this. Like if I didn't have 3 beers in front of me, I would be crushing this thing. That is delicious. But so far, both light-bodied. The carbonation obviously adds a little bit more of like a perception to that. I can see people easily just saying that Lambic kind of tastes a little, on the watery side. But that's one of the things is that with these beers, you can get to, full attenuation. You can have everything gone in the bottle, and it can be. They're all, they are bone dry, in terms of finish. And so, the carbonation really helps give it that sense so that it doesn't feel all that watery. It feels like it has some body to it, even though there may be no actual residual sugar.
Interesting. Because you usually think of carbonation as almost adding like a thinning mouthfeel to a beer.
Yeah, which is interesting because I think it does do that for beers that have a higher gravity to them, because carbonation, again, kind of scrubs the tongue, lifts off of the tongue, and so it makes them seem less dense, but this sort of gives a liveliness to it. And since the bubbles are all, kind of popping in your mouth, it feels like it's filling.
Right.
So, but it's both of these weird, probably perceptions, if anything. But it's fun that they work, that way, because I think it gives something to both of those kinds of styles that they need.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, I've got the Hansen's Oud Gueuze here. It hits all of those, the typical language I think people use to describe these beers. Wet hay.
Yep.
Horse blanket, barnyard. It's super funky.
Do you know what year that sounds like you have a bottle that's a little bit on the older side, and mine sounds like it's maybe a little bit on the younger side, because maybe on the palate I get a little bit of those things, but the Brett doesn't seem to have kind of turned the corner yet. And for that one, that sounds like either they could have blended it that way. As Chris said, these are the Gueuze, especially those are always going to be blended years, usually of 1, 2, and 3-year-old Lambic.
That's what that used to be the common wisdom, or that's what people would say, a Gueuze is a blend of a 1, a 2, and a 3-year-old Lambic. Yeah. And of course, once you dig in, you find out, well, obviously the blenders do whatever they think will make a great beer in terms of the blend.
That's a really good point, yeah.
I don't know what date it's from, but this code on the side basically says...
Oh, God, a code, yeah. Okay, we don't need to get into that.
it's just not marked. Oh, wait, never mind, it is. This was bottled in 2016.
Oh, okay. So there you go.
So that pretty
easily,
old.
Yeah. Well, it doesn't take long. I've been the ones I've been opening this week are all from 2019, and some of them the Brett has just totally, taken over the balance of the aroma and the flavor profile.
Right.
So not surprising that you are getting really strong hay, because that's not what I'm getting. I'm getting strong fruit notes, slightly grassy notes. I'm getting things more in that realm, and you're getting the. But I like both of those. You when you open these, you kind of hope you hit the sweet spot where you just get them all sort of playing together, and that's the dream, right? That's why these are so fun to lay down, and then you open them, and then you're kind of like, oh, where did it all end up in the process? Because again, all of these are from the same year that I'm trying from different producers, and it's all different.
Right.
They're all so different in terms of how they've aged. It's been very interesting.
Well, and one thing that's worth mentioning is when you go to the store and you see one of these bottles and you think, oh, I don't know if I want to spend, $10 or $15 on a little, this is $3.75 here.
$3.75, yeah.
But seriously, if this was bottled in 2016 and one of the beers in it was 3 years old, that means they were working on this essentially, well, the oldest beer in it is 9 years old,
Right.
There's a little more going on here than there is with your average, compare that to whatever pint of hazy IPA you paid $6 a pint for anyway. Come on.
Yeah.
It seems like a steal when you think of it that way.
What fruit Lambic did you get? What fruit did you have? I think you got a traditional one, right?
Yeah, I've got raspberry framboise, and that's from Bone, I think is how they pronounce it. Looks like the word boon, but pronounced bone.
You're right. Yep.
And this one I think is quite old as well. It says best before 2021. I wouldn't be shocked if that's 10 years old.
Yeah, and then I'm looking at the cork on the blender, and this one is from 2020. So it's got a couple of more years on it. But I could smell. I was just holding the beer kind of down here, in the. If you're coming up on Certified Cicerone, you're going to learn about the distance sniff once you start studying for the tasting exam. I could just smell the grapes from down there. I mean, I was holding it, 6-8 inches from my nose, and it's so the fruit notes are still there, because as fruit lambics age, those kind of fade away a little bit, and then again, kind of those fermentation characteristics, Brett characteristics tend to take over in the balance of the beer.
Yeah, in a way, when you buy a fruited sour ale or a fruited lambic, you're really kind of not supposed to lay those down. The fresh fruit burst of fruitiness is, better when it's fresh.
Yep.
And by fresh, I mean, some of the beers that are in there might be 3 or more years old.
Right.
But they're going to macerate that fruit, do a re-fermentation on that fruit, let it go for only a few more months, and then bottle it.
Exactly. Yeah.
So the fruit
and then
has, in fact, kind of been fermented out quite a bit from this one I'm drinking. It's very bready. It's very funky. It's still kind of jammy, but
Yeah.
it's actually got a touch of oxidation at this point, so it probably is quite old. And I just bought both of these off the shelf from my local beer shop last week.
And and to your point in that last year was its, best buy date. Gueuze and Lambic producers are quite aggressive with their best buy dates. Some of them even 20 years for best buy dates. So I think you've got a pretty old one.
I can tell that is quite old.
Which is very cool. Mine's, again, just as we kind of mentioned, it's still, again, very, very more, very fruit forward. Not super jammy. It's a little bit more of like this kind of dried grape note. Kind of it's very wine-like. For Pinot Noir grapes, this is kind of hitting the, it's kind of hitting that note for me in terms of my experience. But there's still just these little whispers of grassiness, little whispers of just like freshly cracked like wheat grain, wheat crack, kind of like a almost Triscuit cracker.
Yeah, the Gueuze I get a lot of bready malt character from this beer. What I identify as those farmy kind of wet hay, those kind of wet hay flavors, I sometimes have trouble figuring out, where does the bready malt start and stop related to the wild, funky, wet hay kind of flavors that from the Brett.
Absolutely. Yeah, so kind of what we're seeing is there's a lot of things like we've talked about before that are extremely similar. And so I think as we talk about the brewing process, you can just kind of, a lot of what we're talking about, you can just kind of lump in with one another, except for obviously, as Chris was saying when he was talking about the maturation on fruit, that would obviously be the standout with fruit lambic, and then obviously the blending process would be the standout with Gueuze.
Mm-hmm. I did actually just notice that this Bone Framboise says 2018 right on the top. So not as old as I thought.
Oh.
But maybe
they might,
not.
I mean, for fruit lambic, they might just be saying, I mean, that's not a bad date for fruit lambic, 3 years.
Right. It still comes across as a bit aged, like maybe it wasn't stored that well. Or as a listener, if you're sitting here just listening to us describe these beers, you're probably hopefully wondering, like, how do these wacky flavors even come about, right? So, I want to make sure we hit all the information about the beer. So we kind of talked there about aroma and flavor. We talked a little bit about appearance, right? So Lambic and Gueuze, with Lambic, you're looking at like kind of straw to light amber. Gueuze, you're looking at kind of like more of a gold to light amber, right? So it doesn't get quite as pale. And fruit lambic obviously depends on the fruit.
Absolutely.
Just to kind of hit these bullets, though, the mouthfeel and the finish for these beers generally, these are going to be very dry beers. They're pretty light in body generally. Gueuze, of course, will be typically highly carbonated, whereas straight lambic will not be. Sometimes straight lambic, I've had bottled lambic that was kind of like petulant, right? Yeah. Because it does have a little bit of sugar in it when it's bottled, and it will ferment slightly in the bottle. Yep. Let's move on to sort of brewing ingredients and process. So how do you end up with these wacky, funky beers? So first of all, the grain bill, it's going to be like 30 to 40% unmalted wheat, 60 to 70% Pilsner malt. That's very normal. To deal with the unmalted wheat, you have to do this special kind of mash called a turbid mash. And the point of the turbid mash is to gelatinize and make accessible the unmalted wheat's sugars. And the result is that you get this highly dextrinous wort full of unconverted starches. These are like long chain dextrins and starches that will serve as food for the Brettanomyces over a long period of time. Scott, you were just looking into turbid mashing. It sounded like you had a good handle on it.
Yeah, so turbid mashing is essentially a form of step mashing. So you're going to be using multiple temperatures in the mash. And so the key things is you're going to start lower than saccharification, and you're going to have a little bit of a thicker mash. So the amount of water you have compared to the grist that you have is going to be lower than usual. And that's because you're going to be adding a lot of hot liquor to the mash, and that's how you're going to end up raising the temperature. And so what you do is you kind of start at that protein rest, you add a little bit of hot water to get there, you let it sit there, then you draw what they call a turbid draw. So you take out, a certain amount of it. It varies with, with producers how much is taken out. Every time you draw, have your turbid draw. And obviously it's called turbid because once you draw all of that word out, it's cloudy. It is turbid, and so that's where it gets its name from.
Yeah, it looks like milky. It's like milky and white.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Then once that turbid draw has been taken out, you add back boiling water to, again, raise it to that next temperature, repeat the process, take out your second turbid draw, add more hot water, and then once you're going to mash out, that's when you add all of that turbid wort back into the mash, and then that's when you would get into your mash out temperature, and then you would begin getting your first runnings, and you would lauter, and you would Vorloff, and you would do all of that, all the rest of the process, and then you would sparge, obviously. So that's kind of how it works. It's kind of like, it kind of makes you think of like decoction mashing, but you're taking out some of the liquid instead of the mash, and instead of bringing the solids back in, you're leaving all of those, liquids until the end. So there's a lot of similarities there in between those two. As well. And the reason you're drawing those turbid draws, and you're heating those up so that you're stopping enzymatic activity.
Right.
And so that keeps those longer chain sugars that you were talking about, which down the line, Brettanomyces can feed on and be able to work on, and so you can actually end up with these beers.
Right. So yeah, we're going to talk about the whole mixed fermentation thing here in a second, but basically, your average kind of Saccharomyces yeast strains, they just are incapable of processing those longer chain starches. So when they get done, there's still some food left for Brettanomyces. That's kind of the idea. So the turbid mash thing is pretty much unique to these beers.
Right.
And then the spontaneous fermentation is also pretty much unique to this genre of beers and other like wild ales made in the craft beer world. I think it's fair to say we're, for the most part, all inspired by these beers.
Absolutely.
The spontaneous fermentation thing, I think, is very romantic. Everybody has this really beautiful vision of it, You've seen maybe pictures of how they do it at Cantillon. They make the wort using this turbid mash method. Then they pump it up to what's called a cool ship up near the roof of the building, and they just kind of open the windows, right, and let ambient bacteria and whatever microflora just get in there and get to work, which is pretty unique. It also needs to be said that I think all of these breweries are dumping a certain amount of beer where that mix of bugs just where things don't work out that well.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, that's possible, yeah.
Yeah. I've read that a lot of these breweries are dumping, a significant percentage of beer. There's a reason these beers are so expensive. It's not just because they take years to make. They also have to dump some of it. It's also why they do most of their brewing during the cold seasons of the year. Because during the hot seasons of the year, these bugs just kind of ferment in a more out of control way.
Yeah.
So the wort is allowed to become infected with wild yeast and bacteria from the environment overnight in these open vessels. It's not like all of these bugs are just floating in through the window, right? These rooms, the rafters, the barrels the beer is put in later, they all contain some of this microflora, and that's one of the reasons that each of these Gueuze or Lambic makers have a house character. If you get a beer from Cantillon, you can kind of tell it's from Cantillon. That wouldn't really happen if every time it was just a random bunch of microflora, right?
Right.
So that just needs to be said. The microflora exist in this brewing and fermenting space to some extent, right? And in the barrels. So it's not necessarily, I guess, 100% wild is what I'm getting at. The breweries usually leave the wort for maybe a day in that cool ship, and then they stick it in barrels and let that microflora get to work. The simplified version of that fermentation is the first bugs that get to work are Enterobacter. these are the kind of bugs that create like a vomity, bilious character. These are the first.
Okay, I see what you're saying.
E. coli. That's what I was trying to think of.
Oh, E. coli.
Right?
Okay, I see.
So these are actually like, you wouldn't want to drink this beer, this wort, for the first bunch of days that it's fermenting, because it's full of like kind of like poopy bacteria.
Right.
So the first thing that happens is these Enterobacter get in there and they work on the beer and make all these like weird flavors in it that will come through in the end in a way that adds some kind of funk. Right. I think often referred to as like bilious. And obviously you don't want the beer to be like pukey or something. But next, you're going to often get like wild Saccharomyces strains taking over and doing a lot of like what we would consider to be like the primary fermentation. So they're going to eat through all those simple sugars.
Yeah.
And then you're going to have lactic acid bacteria like Lactobacillus and Pediococcus. They're going to become ascendant. So like different populations of bacteria and yeast are kind of like taking their turn over months and months, right? And adding their flavor to this very complex beer. So the Lactobacillus and the Pediococcus, those are going to acidify the beer. And eventually you're going to get Brettanomyces taking over as the main bug in there.
Yeah.
Once that becomes ascendant, it will continue to chew through these longer chain dextrins for years and years and years.
Yeah, and something that you've mentioned, with the wild, the sort of wild inoculation romanticism, it's kind of there's kind of the same amount of control that we don't think that the brewers have that they really do, and it's in the use of aged hops. They use kind of these 3+ year old hops that they put in there, so they've, anything that's going to cause any sort of, isovaleric acid kind of character or anything like that has all sort of just been aged off of these hops, and they're really just used for their antimicrobial properties. They're not used for alpha acids or for bittering, really. They will contribute some, but it's very negligible, as the beer, obviously, as, we mentioned early on, the balance is towards sourness and sweetness instead of, with hop bitterness. What that does is that allows that order to kind of happen.
Right.
Because if it didn't, Lactobacillus and Pediococcus might start to outcompete wild Saccharomyces, but they can only handle so much of the presence of these antimicrobial properties, and so they kind of are stunted for a moment. Wild Saccharomyces gets its turn, but then once Lactobacillus and Pediococcus have kind of worked through all of that stuff and they're like, okay, now it's our turn. So we think, it just all kind of happens, they're just sitting there and hoping it all happens and it works out every time. What a miracle. And it's like, well, they kind of have an idea of how much aged hops to use, and some places like older aged hops or certain types, and so again, there's a lot more control there, and they're able to do it a little more consistently, which for us fans kind of does kind of takes down the romanticism a notch.
Well,
but I'd also rather have these good beers every time, because if they didn't do that, we'd get, like you said, listen to all these things Chris is talking about. Like we would get some weird beers,
yeah.
And I don't necessarily need we don't necessarily want those. I'm okay with it.
Yeah, no, the aged hop thing is another like totally unique element of making lambic style beers. These aged hops, you mentioned isovaleric acid. If you don't store hops properly and you let them oxidize, you will get the formation of this compound called isovaleric acid, which smells kind of like stinky gym socks. It's described as cheesy.
Yep.
Right. And I've had lambics or gueuzes by American producers who like probably tried to age their own hops and only did it for like 6 months or a year and just made like these like isovaleric acid bombs.
Yeah.
So you can do it incorrectly.
Absolutely. Of course, yeah.
These aged hops, they use actually a pretty significant amount of hops, but they don't result in any real hop flavor or bitterness in the beer. Your average beer, almost all beers, the balance is sweetness from the malt balanced by hop bitterness, right? And this is one of the few genre of beers that are balanced more like wine, where it's like acidity versus sweetness. These hops, these aged hops, they're not providing any bitterness. They're not providing any real flavor. I would actually say the touch of isovaleric acid that does end up in a lot of these is part of the flavor profile because they are so funky. There's so much going on here. it'd be hard to pull out just a touch of cheesy isovaleric acid.
Yeah. But it works. But it kind of works in the same way that garlic works, right? If you're just tasting garlic, you have too much garlic.
Right.
But also, if you were to put 2 dishes in front and you just said one of them's kind of missing something, I can't tell what it is. Then usually the person just says, "Yeah, I didn't put any garlic," and it's like, "Oh, the other one just has it," and it adds to that overall profile. But like you've said, I've had some that are relative. I mean, I had one that just really was like blue cheese. It was it was this funk and cheese, and I was like, "Oh my gosh." It was extremely unique. It was one of the most unique experiences drinking beer, but
I'm going to ask, I bet I know which one you're talking about. I'm going to ask you after this is done.
All right.
I don't want to like throw anyone under the,
yeah, for sure.
But so, they actually use significant amounts of these hops. Using all those hops does end up selecting for the desired bacteria. Right? Yeah. Because you still get that antimicrobial thing that hops provide to all beer, but you don't get their flavor and bitterness. And so hops are antimicrobial to gram-positive bacteria, it's called. So, including, for instance, botulism. That's pretty important for beers like this.
Right.
Right? I mean, you wouldn't be able to, sell a beer like this if there was even a 0.00001% possibility that it was going to have botulism in it. So the aged hop thing, very unique to this genre of beers.
And really, at the end of the day, Brett is the savior, because we're not just getting potentially weird stuff from, aged hops. We're also getting a metric ton of diacetyl from Pediococcus.
Right.
And also you're in this stage where there's this like ropiness to it where, you can literally pour the beer out of a glass and it just sticks to the side of the glass and it's just
like slime.
Literally looks like a rope. And Brett cleans all of that up. Even if there is some isovaleric acid left over, Brett is really good at esterification and it can create an ester called ethyl isovalerate, which is, fruity and somewhat pleasant as opposed to something like, stinky cheese. So literally all of these things happen and then it's just like finally Brett has arrived, and now everything's going to be okay.
Yeah, Brett not only gives these beers a lot of their amazing flavor, but it also like fixes them, right? It fixes all the kind of weird, nasty stuff that the previous microflora had done to it. Another kind of very unique thing about this genre of beers is mostly applies to Gueuze only, but that's the blending. Because all these barrels of Lambic can have like huge variability, the blending provides the brewers or blenders to put together this very complex and balanced beer. Like if you were just drinking from one barrel, maybe that barrel would be super vinegary, and maybe you want a touch of vinegar in the final beer, but you don't want much, so you're just going to use a little bit of that barrel in this bigger blend.
Yeah, it provides consistency, at the end of the day.
Right, that too. Yep. That actually reminds me, the one bug we really didn't mention is Acetobacter.
Yes.
Right, which oxidizes ethanol into vinegar, acetic acid. The long barrel aging allows just a little bit of oxygen exchange, so some Acetobacter in there can create just a touch of vinegar, but you don't want much vinegar. So I'm just wanted to bring it back around to mention that. The other interesting thing that I would want to mention about that whole phase of the fermentation is all of these bugs, they kind of protect themselves and protect the beer by creating what's called a pellicle on top of it. You've heard about like the angel share, when you make whiskey or beer. Some of the liquid in that barrel is just going to evaporate out, through the wood or whatever. 3 years later, if you're going to this barrel to check out this beer, I mean, there's going to be a lot of headspace. With whiskey making, I think you generally top up those barrels.
Yep.
But with lambic making, they don't really do that. There's a pellicle that forms on top of the beer that actually protects it. It's kind of like almost like a plasticky. I don't know.
It's like a film. It's like a film.
It's a film. It's a film. Exactly. Yeah. It's kind of like a mother on a kombucha.
It's a protective layer.
Right.
It protects from additional oxidation because that's what's kind of happening. There's the headspace is coming down, more oxygen's coming in. They're thinking, oh my gosh, like there's a lot of oxygen happening, and then they create this pellicle, and then it kind of helps to protect it.
Right. Yeah, I've never heard of a lambic maker like topping their barrels up. Have you?
I'm sure some do.
Yeah.
From time to time. But yeah, I don't know if that's necessarily traditional.
Yeah, I don't know. That actually just kind of occurred to me as we were having this conversation. But I think, generally speaking, as far as I'm aware, they just let the pellicle protect the beer.
That's my understanding as well.
Yeah. So, okay, we talked a little bit about blending for Gueuze. This is one of the reasons people really love Gueuze and are just like iffy about straight Lambic. I think even if you carbonate straight Lambic, it's never going to be as complex or lovely as a blended Gueuze. You know, it's another thing that's kind of wine-like. Blend a bunch of barrels to get like this really beautiful product. There's some kind of romanticism about the blending process too, right? There's a lot of things about Gueuze making or Lambic making that really feels romantic. And part of that was that link to this idea of like a rural history of it. So that's why people aren't going to love the changed history. It doesn't change anything for me. I still think it's amazing. I almost think it's more amazing if some business people from Brussels went to England, learned how to do this, came back, did it, and made up this amazing marketing story about it and tricked people for like 200 years. I mean,
they're both great. They're both great. Yeah, they both have their both stories have their own, have their allure to them for sure.
It comes right, this story being blown up comes right after the whole farmhouse ale thing around Saison.
Right.
Of people being like, oh, wait, there are actually farmhouse ales being made in Europe by actual farmers in like Norway and stuff. So we have to stop calling Saison a farmhouse ale.
Right.
So anyway, craft beer just blowing up all this mythology. All right, so let's talk about fruit additions in fruited lambics. A lot of these brewers are using about 2 to 3 pounds of fruit per gallon of beer, and that's for the normal release.
Yeah, that's a lot.
It's bananas. When I ordered that book,
and then
they sent me this, you know,
the Lupepe label, yeah.
So Lupepe is Cantillon's like higher end stuff. The 2 to 3 pounds of fruit per gallon, of course, it depends what fruit you're talking about, how much they're going to use, and all that. But for the Lupepe beers, it's like 50% more even.
And there's different barrels that they use for that particular one. I believe it's used Bordeaux barrels. So so that's they kind of, you're right. It's kind of that higher end. They step it up. It's a lot less production, harder to find, etc.
Yeah. I've mostly only gotten those beers in Belgium. The main kinds of fruited lambic, you've got Kriek made with sour cherries, and it's got to be said, the sort of most traditional one, cherry to make these beers with. I'm definitely going to butcher the pronunciation, but it's like
a tough one.
Yeah, it's like Sharbixa.
Yeah, it's something like that.
Yeah, it's a cherry from like the Seine Valley area. My understanding is that Brussels, you know, used to be a much smaller city, obviously, and was surrounded by all these, you know, farms and orchards. And the cherry that grew there was this Sharbixa type cherry. As the city expanded, these cherries really became pretty endangered. Like, for instance, the Lupepe Cantillon Kriek is made with Sharbixa cherries, but their normal one isn't because there's not even enough.
Yeah.
So that's just like some trivia. And then, so for raspberries, that's called a framboise. So that's what I got here. Peaches, it's called a pêche. Black currant, a cassis? How do you...
I pronounce it cassis, but I have no idea if it's correct or not.
Cassis, I think. Apples, palm, right? And whenever you hear anyone describe a beer as having like palm fruit esters, right? They're talking about apples and pears. POMME. So those are the main ones. I don't know. Do you have any others, Scott?
I've heard there's banana ones. Blueberries happens a lot here in the States.
Okay.
That's one we really, really like to do. Blueberries, blackberries. People like to do mixes of cherries, cranberries, and raspberries. They kind of like to do a medley. So yeah, there's all sorts of fun ways to play
Grapes.
with it. Yep. Yeah, Pinot Noir grape, and lots of white wine grapes too. Cantillon does a lot of different stuff with different kinds of grapes. I think Vigneron is one of their most popular ones or well-known ones that uses wine grapes.
So, I mentioned in the beginning that we were going to go down the whole Certified Cicerone syllabus list of beer styles and do a show for each one. And if you know anything about Beer Scholar, you know that we train people to pass the Cicerone exams. That's mostly what we do. We've got a online course for the Certified Beer Server exam, an online course for the Certified Cicerone exam. Keep an eye out for some advanced Cicerone stuff coming, like coaching program, kind of a course. We're still working on it. If you want to learn a ton about beer, you want to pass these exams, really increase your knowledge, get good at tasting, all that kind of stuff, go to thebeerscholar.com, check all that stuff out. And so now we've pretty much given you most of the information you need about Lambic and Gueuze and fruited Lambic, but we're gonna go just talk a little more about style comparisons and BJCP numbers for like the uber nerds out there who are actually signed up for the course. Thanks for joining us for this podcast episode, our first style episode. Scott, do you have any opinion on the name sipping with style, sipping in style?
I'm personally a fan of sipping in style. I kind of like that one.
Yeah.
But yeah, that doesn't jumps out to me.
I'm leaning on it. I already bought the URL.
That says it all.
Anyway, if you have an idea about what you think we should name this podcast, you should definitely stick that in the comments. Also, subscribe.
Yes, that's right.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us. Thanks, Scott.
Yeah.
Let's go tell the uber nerds what they need to know for the exam. What's up, beer geeks? Chris here. We just covered pretty much everything you need to know about Lambic, Gueuze, and fruited Lambic. But Scott and I go on for another 15 or 20 minutes. We talk about a few different topics, including how those styles compare to similar-ish sour styles in the BJCP guidelines, such as Gueuze and Berliner Weiss. We talk about some tricks for memorizing their BJCP stats. You'll notice that there's a bit of a ladder of quant stats for these in the BJCP. We talk about ways that these can make appearances on the Certified Cicerone written or tasting exam, right? I mean, generally speaking, you're not going to be getting blind tasted on Cantillon, right? The program's not going to do that, but there's other ways you might run across these styles on the test. We talk about some affordable and available commercial examples you can seek out because, as we know, these are not all affordable and are not all available. And we get into a little discussion about the effects of aging fruit lambics on fruit that is pitted and not pitted. That's kind of a fun one. And we also talk about some good and bad food pairing options. So if you're signed up for a Beer Scholar course, you're studying for the exam or whatever, you'll get that extra bonus material. Otherwise, here is the outro. Thanks for listening.
If there's anything we left out, all of you studying, if there's any questions that you might be wondering about, if you've got an exam date coming up, throw them in the comments. We really, really try and keep and stay on top of those and respond to everybody as much as we can. So please ask away.
Yeah, love that. Yeah, ask away. All right. Well, I think that'll do it. I think
that sounds good.
First episode, we knew it would be a little messy. I think that went pretty well.
Yeah.
We'll see.
I agree.
We'll see how the final recording looks and sounds. All right. Cheers.
Cheers.